Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Michelle Whitty. I'm here with John Kiriakou, and we are, of course, talking about how much everything costs and why is that happening right now? Why does it keep happening? And as John pointed out earlier in the show, why does the Biden administration continue to be surprised by things that it really seems like everybody else was predicting? Mm-hmm. Joining us for this fun conversation is Steve Grumbine. He's founder and CEO of the nonprofits Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. He's host of the podcast Macro and Cheese, and he is also an activist and evangelist for modern monetary theory. Steve, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right, so we've got inflation at 8.6%. This is a 40-year high. We've got gas on the precipice of hitting an average of $5 a gallon, which is a new record after a series of records, although, as I learned, not the inflation-adjusted record, which was in summer of 2008, when in today's dollars, gas was $5.44 a gallon.
Oh, how interesting.
And that seems to have been what tipped us in, well, some say, right? That was the straw that broke the consumer camel's back. This month's increase, of course, was driven by sharp rises in the prices for energy, which was up 34.6% year on year. Groceries also were nearly 12% higher in May year on year. All of this means these costs are inescapable for regular people, right? It's not like new cars are 35% more expensive, you know, or even cigarettes or something. And yet, Steve, you know, we talked about this last week. Most of what we have heard from the Biden administration lately is that they need to do a better job of conveying that they feel our pain. What do you think they should be doing?
Well, you know, I think this is such a fundamental thing. It's so fundamental that it kind of blinds us. Mm-hmm. You know, we're so used to free market fundamentalists acting like there's no role for government here. Libertarians don't want there to be any role for government here. A lot of anarchists don't want there to be a role for government here. But in fairness, government has always been supposed to be that bulwark, that barrier between us and abuse of market power, monopoly behavior, price gouging, etc. And so, you know, you heard Pete Buttigieg recently talking about how the government is not in the business of creating baby formula, as an example. Yeah. You see our government, I think I talked about this previously, we have no national energy policy in this country. Mm-hmm. So all of these are free market enterprises going about doing their thing. And, you know, ultimately, the free market is bearing itself out here. Mm-hmm. There's nothing preventing price gouging. There's nothing preventing these abusive market powers. We have not funded the kind of regulatory environment with teeth that the people would want because business doesn't want it. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, this is largely what you're looking at. I mean, you obviously had supply shocks. We're still dealing with supply shocks with things like the semiconductors that you see in most of the high-end electrical products, internet products, IT products, all the computer supplies, all of that. I mean, large major companies like Cisco are telling their buyers that, you know, there's like up to a 1-year wait for services or for equipment that previously took maybe 90 days. So we're dealing with the results of supply shocks. We're dealing with the results of having no energy policy and zero audit capability and enforcement capability. But we're also dealing with something else, too, and that's this new desire for raising interest rates. And what interest rates do, it's interesting, you know, what it does is it literally makes the cost of credit too expensive to get. But the people that would use the kind of credit we're talking about typically are the kinds of people that are desperate that will have to use it anyway. And so, you know, you've got poor people paying the price of inflation with 30 and 40% interest on credit cards and payday lending and all the other wonderful things that we baked into society. But the interest payments, as we've talked about previously, it starts with the overnight window, which is bank-to-bank transactions and the cost of interest on reserves, technical wonky stuff there. Mm-hmm. But it starts matriculating out further. It starts getting to loans. and the cost of loans and so forth. And what Volcker proved in the 70s, and Paul Volcker was the Fed chair back in the day under Jimmy Carter, and possibly one of the worst presidents of all time. And basically they showed that they can destroy the economy, completely shut it down, and kill inflation at the same time. So the idea here is that they're going to try to kill inflation by jacking interest rates up like they did in the 70s. And all that's going to do is destroy the economy and hurt regular people, and accidentally, like that correlation and causation kind of thing, incidentally will bring down inflation, because no one will it'll cause unemployment, because that's ultimately what these folks live by, is this NAIRU, N-A-I-R-U. So that's what you're looking at right there. And it shouldn't be shocking, because Biden's been advised by people from my side of the world, my camp. He has not listened to them at all. He's listened to the new Keynesians, the Krugmans, the Jason Furmans, and all these other fools. And he's basically behaving as a free market neoliberal. And the reason why he's acting like he can't do anything is because even though he could do something, it would fundamentally violate that free market belief system that got him into office to begin with anyway. It
does seem tragic that the only way that we have decided inflation can be managed is by just throwing a bunch of people out of work. Right. And so I have to ask, I mean, I think I know what your answer to this is going to be, but I'm sure you saw this Axios story that, was talking about the price of gas and saying, 10 of the last 11 recessions the U.S. has been in since World War II were, what is the word I'm looking of? Right before they happened, there was a huge surge in energy prices. I'm missing a word. Yes, preceded. There we go. They were preceded by a surge in energy prices. And so that is sort of assumed to be what sort of tips the country into recession. Although you have people also saying, actually, that's not what does it. It is the interest rate hikes that do it. And so I wonder if you think every time, when the Fed is saying, look, we're gonna manage this really cunningly, right? We're gonna hit just the right spot and everything will be okay, when in fact they know what they are doing is causing a recession.
Yeah, market fundamentalists, monetarists, you see a lot of UBI people sadly fall in this camp because they still worship at the throne of Milton Friedman, the killer of Chile. These guys are not understanding at all what's going on around them. Okay. So one of the hardest things I think right up front is just understanding why the fuel prices are high, which will help fuel why things are the way they are and why we're stuck dealing with the situation as it is. We've got, let's say, 100% use of oil the way it always has been. And we've got, let's say, 93% of that oil, we already know how it's covered by various groups that already produce it. So that leaves us with who has a little bit of room left over. That's the Saudis. And so what do the Saudis do? The Saudis say, well, we've got a monopoly on the last 7% of the oil everyone needs. We're going to keep raising prices until it destroys the economy, until you can't pay it anymore. And so in order for us to get out of that, we would literally have to have an energy policy. We would literally have to move to renewables, something like that. But to the larger point of what you're saying here, it's interest rates and energy prices. It's both. So interest rates naturally give the rich more money. And what do the rich do with their money? It's not like they're buying extra gallons of milk. They go into the fire sector. They buy properties. They elevate asset prices. They create asset bubbles. This drives the cost of everything else up as well. And it causes the cost of just basic goods and services to go up, especially for people that are already paying the last of their residual income to pay for the higher prices of gas. That means they have to buy on credit, which means that the cost naturally goes up anyway. So, really at the end of the day, there's no real good short-term answer, short of subsidies and price controls and things like that. But it would also be something along the lines of just an acknowledgement. And we're not going to have that because we can't even get the progressive community to stop trading in libertarian territory, talking nonsense. I mean, just the other day, Jimmy Dore had frickin' Peter Schiff, Ron Paul's guy, on. I'm like, what the F are you doing? Why are you doing this? But there you go. This is what is being masqueraded as, leftist progressive. It's ridiculous. It's a shame.
Yeah.
But in order.
No, I agree, Steve. I mean, it's hard to get your head around because you are talking about, or in this case, we are talking about very big sort of philosophical and political changes. And it's really tempting to think, well, what if we just ignore that elephant over there and we keep and we just tinker hard enough, right? Because I was going to ask, are there, we have talked to you and to other guests on this show about the counterinflationary powers of investment, right? Massive public investment. You have talked just now about, what, the impact of having a national energy policy would be on situations like this. And so I was going to ask, are there, in the sort of tool set that anybody has now, right? Whether it is sort of monetary or political, is there any short-term any sort of short-term mechanism that we could pull out to do something other than to mess around with interest rates, right? You mentioned price caps. You mentioned subsidies. I feel like subsidies would get a lot of political pushback, because of this idea that, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. But
yeah, hold on. Let's stop right there because that is not the case at all.
Right.
And I don't want to get too deep into this bubble here, but the fact is that it depends on where the inflation is coming from, right? There's a couple of things. Inflation's coming from three really specific places. Number one is supply chains. How would you address a supply chain issue? You would build the infrastructure out to support the flow of those goods, or you would nationalize or change how you do your supply chain. If you found that your supply chains are fragile using this global method, you may have to fundamentally change how you build out your infrastructure and how you build your supply chains. So that's one. You got to have a different solution for that. And that right there would be a great national investment. And that's what China is doing with the One Belt, One Road initiative. So there is a precedent there for people actually doing good things and seeing good results. And we just refuse because we've demonized China. So we can't do that. The other one is, that when the businesses, and there was a great article in the Guardian a couple weeks back that showed the massive profits each of these companies is bringing in during this pandemic as they're crying about inflation.
Oh, yeah.
And so we know fundamentally that these parasite CEOs and CFOs and all their, stockholders are looking for them to raise the ROI because they know that their ROI is key to getting investors paid. And that's what investors want. So what do? They gouge during this price. So there's an opportunity right there to address gouging. So that's two of the three. And then the third is a national energy policy. And then there was one thing that's not spoken of that I think needs to be spoken of, and that is what happens when you start dealing with layoffs. What do we do for regular people? And this is where a fundamental proposal that I brought up on this show many times, the federal job guarantee, comes into play. This right here is like if you ever wanted to see a neon sign saying, now's the time, this is where a Green New Deal saves us from inflation, saves us from the energy crisis, and fundamentally changes the balance of labor and capital by giving a federal job guarantee with a federally funded, locally administered public option, as opposed to just laying people off. And so the opportunity is there to do all those things. We just lack, first of all, we lack a movement that understands the stuff. Most people are just sort of whirling dervishes and teacups, chasing little things, little anthills, and not looking at the larger picture. It's understandable. If you don't know, you don't know. So we have a major communication gap in getting these things out there. The other part of this is more fundamental, and that is that a lot of people genuinely believe that the federal government is constrained like their household budget. They don't realize the power of the federal government. So naturally, I still see all these good, well-meaning Democrats running around praising Biden for $1.3 trillion in deficit reduction, which is going to bring about a freaking recession. It's going to bring about a major recession. It's probably going to go worse. It's probably going to become a depression, to be honest with you.
It does kind of give you vertigo reading these stories. Of course, I saw that Guardian story that you referenced that shows, the companies that have been sort of complaining about raising prices, complaining about soaring commodity prices, but meanwhile seeing record profits, right? And then also you have a new report out earlier this week about the ever-growing gap between CEO pay and employee pay. You have the Biden administration really week after week in different formats asking companies not to raise prices, but not doing anything about it. And you see the Fed raising interest rates, and we are, everyone, John and I mentioned yesterday, everyone that CNBC just interviewed for its chief financial officer survey said, yep, a recession's coming. And yet you just don't see these things put together very much, And so it's like each economics article is sort of born in a vacuum, like a baby economist crawling out of the ground, learning things for the new time, for the first time, unable to put these ideas together. And yeah, it is frustrating because they're, I think obviously what our conversations all come down to is that there's sort of wholesale political change that is needed, because otherwise everything you're doing is sort of inconsistent with other actions you're taking. And yet that requires just, looking fully at our political economy and deciding to fundamentally change who we are as a country.
You've nailed it. One of the things that's very important to remember is that wherever there's a deficit, there's a surplus somewhere else. Okay? There's always, these are mirrors. There's always, for one person's spending is another person's income. Okay? So the real issue is, where's the money going? Number one, you look at that, you see the flows. They're not hard to find. But the other thing is, we keep assuming that the government, and I am a big government guy. I'm ready for the big central planning. I am a big C kind of guy. Trust me when I say that. But when you look at this government, you're thinking that they're supporting you. You're thinking that they're looking out for your best interest.
Yeah,
it's fundamental. I even find myself accidentally going down that path, thinking, why don't they just know? But the fact is that they're serving capital. Capital wins here. We don't. Yeah. Capital does win.
Hey, Steve, let me interrupt you. I want to ask you one big question, and I've got like 90 seconds left. I apologize. But does this tank the Democrats in the midterms? And then what are Republicans going to do in this economy? Are they going to do anything different?
Well, I think of it this way. Republicans will probably slash taxes, which will be it is a stimulus. It will generate spending, which will then in turn rejigger the economy. The problem is it's not a balanced rejiggering. It ends up being beneficial to the wealthy. Okay, so that's number one. But number two, will the Democrats take a bloodbath? It depends on how many are still terrified of the Roe v. Wade stuff and whether or not that motivates people to the polls or not. I certainly don't. I think it's a kind of a hand wave, though, because they could have solved this by stacking the court. They didn't do any of those things. They knew this was a possibility. So to me, I think the Democrats are going to take a bloodbath, and I think the Republicans are going to go back to what they've always done, which is tax cuts for the rich and shame people for not doing better and making better choices.
I think that's exactly right. And once again, the Democrats are going to sort of cede this short-term victory to Republicans and just totally lose the long-term because they won't look at it. Steve Grumbine, wish we had more time with you, but thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us. That was Steve Grumbine. You can find his podcast, Macro and Cheese. You can go to Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action to find more work he's doing. Thank you, as always, Steve. We're going to take a quick break here and come right back on Political Misfits. We're on Radio Sputnik. We're live in D.C. We'll talk to you in a minute.